Hello, my name is Victoria Brown, and this is Experiment 1 with charged tapes. So the purpose of this experiment is to prepare charged tape, observe the relative interactions, and determine the amount of excess charge on a singular strip of tape. So the goals include becoming more familiar with charge and properties of matter and experimental design overall. So some main findings of this experiment was that the tape is going to be positively charged, and that we have a deficiency of electrons on one piece of tape that is around 9.3 times 10 to the positive 10. So some fundamental ideas that will be presented throughout this experiment include Coulomb's law, and this law basically states that the electrical force between two charged objects, is directly proportional to the product of the quantity of charge on the objects and inversely proportional to the square of the separation distance between those two objects. Newton's second law of motion, and this law is going to be used to describe how acceleration is directly proportional to the applied force of an object and indirectly proportional to the mass. We also have free body diagrams, which just visually represent the forces acting on an object. So some models, we have point charges and line charges, and this is how we're going to be observing the interactions between the tapes. So per the lab instructions, the system is going to be tape B, and the surroundings is going to be tape A and everything else within the room. There will be 3 strips of tape total. So we're going to form a U-tape by placing one strip on top of another strip on the table and quickly remove that top strip. And we repeat this for the second piece of tape. And then we observe the interaction when placing the U-tape near the other U-tape as well as other objects around the room. We will then suspend tape B and slowly bring tape A closer and observe the change in separation. For the purposes of this experiment, it is assumed that there is air resistance. The air resistance is negligible, and then both pieces of tape have equal net charges evenly distributed, and both pieces of tape have point charges that are located in the center. It is expected that this experiment results in the following observations, such as the tape has a net positive charge, and tape A and tape B repel each other. Some general observations from this experiment: attraction happens when it is U-tape in contact with the hand, or a neutral book, or a plastic pen that has a negative charge. And so when U-tape is in the presence of another U-tape, they repel because they have like charges. On the left, we have the experimental data that is associated with the tape. And on the right, we have the data that was collected from the coding that is going to be presented on the next slide. So for this first part, the gravitational force is going to be in yellow and the electric force is going to be in white. The red sphere represents tape B and the blue sphere represents tape A. And this code is how we obtain the magnitude of these forces as well as the charge. For part 2, the same color code still applies, but in this case we see that the gravitational force is significantly larger than the electric force, unlike the previous slide. So with this experiment, there was a lot of room for error, so there was definitely a possibility for human error in terms of measuring and calculations, coding error, unequal charges on the tapes, and just incorrect positioning of the tapes. So we have to think about what if, and in this case, the what if is what happens if the electrons are now positive and the protons are negative. And the overall observations are going to stay the same in the sense that the like charges repel and opposite charges still attract. And the biggest difference would be that there would be a proton deficiency instead of an electron deficiency. And we have to think of how that impacts the electric field in the sense of direction. We then have to ask why there's a difference between the point charge and the line charge models. And the way we handle the tape also makes a big difference, because when there's a point charge, there's the region of error becomes smaller because we're looking at a specific point. But when we think of a line charge, there's a lot more interaction that happens. So when we're handling the tape, it can become more negative the more points of contact we reach with that tape. And so if that tape becomes more negative and the other tape is still positive, these are now gonna be more attracted than they are in the sense that they want to repel. So from part 1, main conclusion was that the electric force and gravitational force were equal. And in part 2, when modeled as line charges, the electric force and gravitational force, there was a significant difference because that gravitational force was now significantly larger than the electric force.